Now, typically when we learn about something like desegregation, it's usually not coupled with music. I imagine when we think of desegregation, we think of civil rights leaders, court cases, lawyers. But today I'm going to combine these two things of music and desegregation because um, it can be surprising how often the arts are actually at the vanguard, at the lead of social change. They're doing things before it's socially acceptable in mainstream spaces. And so yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing, looking at music and how it played a role in desegregation in the 1940s and 50s. Beginning with pachucos that we've already talked about. Pachucos were youth that were from non-mainstream white groups or groups that weren't the mainstream, including ethnic whites like Italians and Jews, Russians, etc., who weren't considered fully white yet. That doesn't happen until starts happening in the 1950s with suburbanization, and then in generations after that. And so in that context, pachucos and zoot suiters were people claiming space, claiming public space, and desegregating spaces that were segregated. Part of the reason that people didn't like them is because they would go to mixed race, mixed ethnic group dances, for example. And so that's part of the reason they were criminalized. That's part of the reason they were feared. You might recall with regard to the Zoot Suit riots, the rhetoric, the language that was used at the time was a lot of they're insulting our women versus no, they're the ones insulting our women. Speaking in these misogynist patriarchal terms about ownership of women. And so, again, these pachucos came into conflict with servicemen, although pachucos were also servicemen, in these ethnic Mexican neighborhoods where their claiming of public space was contested, people butting into each other and having tensions arise from coming into contact with each other on the sidewalks. Again, them being criminalized, them being sort of their spaces seen as dangerous spaces because they were not following segregation. They were participating and encouraging desegregated spaces, and in particular, young people dancing together. Then there is the history of jazz. In particular, with the 1930s, starting with swing music, big band in the 40s, and rhythm and blues in the late 40s. A lot of this, again, today we think of jazz as one of the most American of musical genres, probably up, along with rock and roll. But back then, jazz music was seen essentially as black music. It was seen, and back then they would call it race music. And so it was not as mainstream as a lot of sources or movies today make it seem, as widely accepted. And so these were, at the same time that there's a backlash to these musical movements, at the same time, they're encouraging integration and they're encouraging There's growing exposure to these musics, increasingly to the mainstream in ways that were not allowed prior to World War II. Now, some specific examples of some of these things that I'm talking about. One would be the musician Chuck Higgins. Chuck Higgins was an African-American saxophone player, and he noticed that when he was in the Southwest touring, having concerts throughout the Southwest, much of his audience were Mexican Americans. And so he started dedicating some of his songs to that Mexican American audience. One of those songs was called Pachuco Ha. I'll play a clip of that for you. All right, it's all instrumental. And but again, showing kind of recognition of who the audiences were of these African American musicians, and then a reciprocal kind of relationship in dedicating music to them. Other examples would be the blues and mambo. Mambo, a Latin American genre of music that was popular at the time. Torta is Spanish for sandwich. And Boyle Heights. Boyle Heights is the name of a neighborhood just east of Los Angeles, which was a very multi-ethnic neighborhood, but that was becoming increasingly predominantly Mexican American in the 1950s. And, you know, with Pachuco Hop, presumably there's a dance associated, a dance step at least associated with the song. Here's a few more examples about the increasing interracial, interethnic influences that were happening in the 1940s and 50s, and music playing an important role in leading the way. It's not just laws or civil rights leaders or courts doing this, it's people in everyday life increasing integration. One example is from Johnny Otis. Johnny Otis was a Greek American from Northern California who moved to Southern California when he was a teenager. He was young enough where he was still able to do a couple years of high school, but the high school he went to was in Watts, in the Los Angeles area, South LA. And there he joined a predominantly Black band. So he was a white drummer in a Black band in Watts. He ended up marrying his high school sweetheart, who was a Black woman, and he considered himself Black by persuasion. And for much of his life, he ended up dedicating it to promoting African-American music to broader audiences, white audiences. Let's see some examples of that. So he would promote dances to mixed audiences, exposing whites and Mexican Americans to Black music. These dances would get shut down and criminalized by the police, shutting them, that would try to shut them down for any excuse. And so, yeah, he was promoting rhythm and blues, which at the time was considered what today we might call Black music. He ended up in the early 1950s, he had 3 TV shows. And again, in these TV shows, they were about music, and they were specifically about promoting rhythm and blues or African American artists and their music. Here, I'll play for you a short example of that. That is Johnny Otis there on his show.
Go ahead, John.
So jive, a reference to African American slang. And so with hand jive, about expressing yourself with your hands. Johnny Otis also started his own rhythm and blues recording label to record musicians, record music. And one of the artists that he recorded and that had a hit was little Julian Herrera. Little Julian Herrera became the first Mexican-American, the first successful Mexican-American rock and roll heartthrob. And so this is before Ritchie Valens, which I'll get to in a little bit. Now I want to break down a little bit how much interracial, interethnic mixing is going on here. And it's okay if you don't catch all this, because there's a lot going on here. So that was a 1956 hit called Lonely, Lonely Nights, which is a Mexican-American version of a Black vocal style, rhythm and blues, on a record produced by Otis, a white man, who thought of himself as Black by persuasion. And to make this even more mixed up, it turns out that little Julian Herrera, the first Mexican-American rock and roll heartthrob, had actually been adopted by a Mexican mother in East Los Angeles. But he had been born Ron Gregory, a Hungarian Jew from the East Coast. And so there's just a lot of intermixture, inner influence going on. And so again, it's people in music playing important roles in desegregation of the time. Other examples, Mike Stoller and Jerry Lieber are Jewish Americans that were important for writing music. In particular, I'll focus on Mike Stoller here. Jewish American who wrote dozens of successful songs for Black artists celebrating African American life. So again, interesting. Jewish American men writing songs for African American artists about African American life, and ended up, having success. One example of that would be Big Mama Thornton, who had a hit. So this was a hit that Big Mama Thornton had in 1953. Some of you may recognize it because in 1956, 3 years later, Elvis Presley had his version become an even bigger hit. Now, today, you know, a lot of this music can seem rather tame for us, you know, maybe associating it with, it's not working. You know, maybe associating it with baby boomers or something, and you know, and inevitably, you know, thinking of all that is quite tame. But for its time, you know, even if even Elvis Presley was controversial and censored to a degree, um, you know, these other artists were even, you know, were working to overcome even larger barriers. Um, if you're not familiar with some of that censorship, you know, like one example would be that Elvis Presley was people thought that he would gyrate his hips too much, and so then they started covering him just from the waist up, so to not be too tempting for all the audience members. But yeah, you know, people have been, and there's pros and cons to some of this. You know, you could argue, people have argued, you know, that there was cultural appropriation, um, although, and that a lot of artists got shortchanged by the record studios. In a lot of cases, they didn't make the money that they should have for such large hits that they ended up having. But regardless of that, with the focus here is that there's increasing breaking down of those cultural and racial barriers. Even if at times they need, you know, there was a need, even if at times there were white artists that were allowed to get further in their exposure to the mainstream audience. Here is some of you may be familiar with this more recent remake, making use of Big Mama Thornton's version of Hound Dog. All right, moving on to Ritchie Valens. So some of you may be familiar with Ritchie Valens. If you've ever taken a Spanish class, I know a lot of Spanish classes have students watch the movie La Bamba, in a movie that came out like in the 1980s. So Ritchie Valens was a Mexican American from the Los Angeles area, just north of Los Angeles, area called the San Fernando Valley. And he was born in the United States in Los Angeles with to Mexican parents. And so he learned Mexican music from his parents and relatives. He learned rhythm and blues from the radio. Uh, he learned to play the guitar from his uncle, and that's how he learned to play the original version of La Bamba. La Bamba is a traditional Mexican song, in particular from the state of Veracruz, which is on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, which is one of the parts of Mexico that has the strongest African influence in Mexico. And so there's that part of it as well. He also liked country music. And when he was in high school in 1957, he was a member of a band called the Silhouettes, and it was also very multi-ethnic, multiracial. Members of the Silhouettes included an Italian American, a Mexican American, a Japanese American, and an African American. So again, very diverse. A lot of people coming together. Increasingly, people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds coming together in this time period, and musicians, and in spaces where people listened and danced to music, breaking down those segregation barriers. Then he ended up being, for lack of a better word, discovered by an independent record producer who got him to have a lot of quick success. He was encouraged to change his name to Valens from Valenzuela. And yeah, he very quickly became a mainstream star in the US. Let's see, here's a couple of songs. So these are pictures of the actual Ritchie Valens, and what we're listening to is also the actual Ritchie Valens. Now, the reason I'm saying the actual Ritchie Valens is because a lot of his music is more familiar to people from the movie La Bamba, and in the movie La Bamba, they didn't use his voice and music. They were using modern artists. Los Lobos is another Mexican-American great band, but it wasn't Ritchie Valens playing that music, or whose music we were listening to in that movie.
Here's a bit of rattlesnake.
So Lou Diamond Phillips playing Ritchie Valens for the movie. And let's see. La Bamba was not the first song in Spanish to become a mainstream hit in the US, but it is one of the earlier and biggest mainstream hits. Probably the first one by a Mexican American. There were artists who were not Latino or Latin American who had hits before. And then there's also a local connection to Ritchie Valens. Eau Claire. There used to be a dance hall close to where the current courthouse is and jail in Eau Claire. There used to be a dance hall there. And Ritchie Valens, along with other big artists like Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper. So they were all touring together, and they performed in Eau Claire, and this was their penultimate show, meaning they left Eau Claire and they went to their next show. So their next show was their last. because when they left that next show, they got on a plane that crashed and they died, and they referred to it as the day that music died. But yeah, so second to last place that these artists played at, including Ritchie Valens, was in Eau Claire. And so there's this memorial thing, recognizing that.